So, John, when the critics write about executive compensation, they eventually come around to calling it just unfair. So, how should we think about this issue of fairness when we think about executive compensation? What should fair look like?
I think of fairness from two different points of view. First off, there are a number of companies that have devised their own homegrown principles for fairness. For example, Ben & Jerry's and Whole Foods established ratios that set the maximum of the compensation of the top person in the company versus the average worker, and therefore stipulate a fairness principle that no one can make more than X times the average worker. That is one way to attack the fairness question. A second that I use is a notion of relative performance of the company. That is, how is this company performing versus its competitors, and even versus companies not in its industry in the market for publicly traded securities, for example. And generally speaking, I would say the CEO of a company that's providing exceptional shareholder returns over an extended period of time, as did Roberto Goizueta at Coca-Cola, for example, in some sense deserves much higher compensation than that of his competitors and even, again, CEOs in other industries. So I would anchor an argument of fairness in those two ways. One, do we as a company have a principle that says here's how much we're going to pay? And two, do we perform better than other companies do? But there are many companies, I mentioned General Motors example earlier, who have made some decisions where they're clearly shifting compensation in the early 90s in favor of the top management and against the interest of the workers, demonstrated by larger bonuses to management and layoffs to the workers. I'd be hard pressed to say that that's fair in any sense. It seems to me that does damage both to the reputation of the company and to the fabric of the workforce within the company. So I think fairness comes into play in those ways. And again, third example we touched on earlier, some countries have a different value system for what the relative value of a CEO is versus others. And so I think we have attached a great value to producing big improvements in the equity value of a company, and with that, big compensation for CEOs.
So Don, if you take the issue of fairness and look at it from an ethical or from an ethics standpoint, how do you think about fairness from that point of view?
Well, aside from ratios, which we don't want the government prescribing ratios, and most ethicists would endorse any kind of self-organized or homegrown set of ratios, but that goes to the numbers. Ethicists would also say that the process is important. The process has to be not just transparent, because you can be very transparent about very complicated numbers and figures to where shareholders and anybody else don't really know what's going on. So there's some process issues around compensation committees, making sure that the compensation committee board members have no conflicts of interest, whether direct or indirect, making sure that there's good independent advice to that committee and the board generally, consulting with the shareholders, making sure that the pay incentives are aligned for long-term performance. Those kinds of things can make, even if the results don't always work, if the process is good, people are generally satisfied that they did their best.
I might just add that some of this apparent unfairness in compensation has come in response to the pundits, the analysts, the shareholder activists, and what have you, who back in the 70s did not like that management compensation was tied principally to accounting numbers. And the argument back then was, by tying them to accounting numbers, we're letting bonuses be set by something that management can manipulate. That led to a shift heavily in favor of using equity instruments to grant compensation. Well, that introduced a huge amount of variability. And if you look at the rise in the consumer price index from 1935 to 2010 of 15-fold, and the rise in the Dow Jones index from 1935 to 2010 of 80-fold, you get some notion of why it is that this addition of equity has produced very large increases in compensation. So in some sense, the shareholder activists and pundits got exactly what they're asking for. Greater tie to shareholder value. And there's been a lot of shareholder value created in the last 75 years.
Excellent.